The first step toward reaching the stars is to realize the void is not empty, it's potential. In the deep night between the stars, humanity may build its greatest cities. Recently, we did episodes exploring how asteroids in the belt might one day evolve into city-states, and that followed up with looks at both deep space habitats and interstellar relays, but I felt those still left much unsaid about what may very well become the most critical infrastructure, and even defining civilizations in the future. Now, you don't need to have seen those earlier episodes to follow along today, though many of the details are explored in greater depth there. Still, 3 ideas carry over. First, space is vast. Second, the rocket equation is not our friend when it comes to crossing it. And third, interstellar space, though unimaginably wide, is not empty. That alone tells us that some kind of infrastructure to span that near infinity must be built, and the mistake people often make is underestimating just how large a role that infrastructure will play, or underestimating just how big humanity is willing to dream and to build. A developed solar system doesn't just sit idle under its star, it begins to harness most of the sunlight rather than letting it spill uselessly into the void. 2 of the potential uses are powering vast interstellar relays and providing sunlight to immense space habitats. As a result, such a civilization could easily support billions of times more people than Earth does now, perhaps many billions of times more, and in comfort. And if even only 1 person in a billion decide to visit Alpha Centauri in a given century, that's 10 billion travelers per century, 100 million a year, roughly 3 people every second. And that's just 1 in a billion from one solar system. We've got over 8 billion people alive right now. I imagine I could find more than 8 customers a year willing to take a trip to Alpha Centauri. Interest is there, but the trip is long and it is energy intense. You'd be looking at dedicating around a terawatt of power per traveler for a few months on either side of the journey to speed and slow them. So if you dedicate a modest fraction of the sun's output to that, it could be pushing something like 100 trillion people at a time, with more like a quadrillion coasting en route. So even a much tinier fraction of the sun's output could support a relay chain able to push trillions of tons of cargo or people out a day, and you probably have such relays in place for the same reason we have freeways, a military and infrastructure necessity that needs to be there, so you might as well use it for recreational travel and commerce too. It is also handy for exporting citizens of the home system out to all the new colonies on the ever-expanding fringe of settled space, awake or frozen for the journey. And of course there's traffic coming back the other way, not to mention the sheer scale once we settle the wider galaxy. Let's say there are 200 billion star systems connected by maybe 20 main trunk lines leading back to Earth. That's about 10 billion systems per line. Each one of those systems sends just 100 pilgrims a year, people wanting to visit humanity's cradle. That's 1 trillion travelers moving along each of those trunk lines every year, being added or subtracted to destinations, and far more moving along at any given time. And because all of this occurs at sublight speeds, those vast interstellar highways, some perhaps 10 light years long, could have trillions of people passing through them at any given moment. Managing those flows would take more than just relay stations. It would demand interstellar bureaucracies, insurers, and safety agencies the size of nations. Traffic protocols could span centuries, and disputes over beam time or lane access might play out in arbitration courts measured in light hours. Much like ancient guilds and maritime laws once knit the seas together, these interstellar agreements and compacts would become the quiet backbone of galactic civilization. Today we are assuming vast relay networks of high-power lasers pushing beams between star systems. Even if vessels were entirely self-propelled, you'd likely still see the emergence of space highways, established routes cleared and maintained for safety and efficiency. The speed of light always feels like a frustrating barrier, but in practice it's rarely worth even approaching. The energy costs rise astronomically, and the shielding and point defense requirements become overwhelming. At near light speeds, a thumb-sized rock strikes with the force of a nuclear explosion. To detect and avoid such an object with only a second to react, you need to spot it as far away as the moon. A rock no bigger than your thumbnail at the moon. It makes far more sense to have established corridors swept clean of debris. These routes also offer another benefit: accountability. When something goes wrong, say a wrench drifts out an airlock and collides with a colony ship carrying 1 million people, it helps to have nearby relays monitoring traffic, providing rescue support and identifying what happened. Such relay stations could project beams of energy to push or slow ships, or fire smaller focus beams to clear debris and guide shuttles for docking. They would run continuous high-intensity radar scans, keeping watch for hazards or stranded travelers. Some might even deploy enormous light sails ahead of convoys, acting like plows to sweep the path clean, before being retrieved or recycled in another relay. And an active radar system also makes it easier for other ships passing by to spot debris when it gets pinged. A reflective sail on its attached vessel can accelerate at 1 g, Earth's gravity, if powered by about 1,500 gigawatts per ton, so a 1,000-ton ship would require around 1.5 million gigawatts to maintain that thrust, or could instead run at a hundredth of a g on 15,000 gigawatts, which might be better for a long-haul colony arc or a freighter, while a million-ton colony ship would need on order of 1.5 billion gigawatts, about 9 times the sunshine that hits Earth to light our days. These numbers may sound extreme, but they illustrate why beamed energy is the most practical way to propel large ships across interstellar distances. And remember, the sun produces a couple billion times more light than hits Earth. Diverting even a few percent of that for purpose of trade and commerce, let alone a few billions of it, certainly seems to make sense. Even with exotic fuels like antimatter, you get a better return on using them to generate and direct energy beams than by burning them aboard each individual rocket. Beam propulsion scales better, serves many ships at once, and forms the foundation for a true interstellar infrastructure. There are many ways to sail a ship, but when you're using a laser sail, that sail has to be enormous, large enough to catch a spreading beam, resist melting under its intensity, and still gather enough power to do the job. Let us imagine for the moment a beam-driven sail roughly circular and 100 miles in radius. It is an ultra-thin sheet, less than a millimeter thick. Near its center sits a slender ring about a mile across, housing the ship's mirror array. That mirror reflects a tiny fraction of the incoming light, perhaps 1 part in a million, to provide sunshine and power for onboard habitat of 10,000 passengers and crew, living in a ring-shaped Stanford torus. The remaining 99.9999% of light is devoted entirely to propulsion, driving a vessel around 10 megatons. What really matters for these sails is not raw strength, but reflectivity and temperature tolerance. The more perfectly a sail reflects the beam, and the higher the temperature can survive without softening or vaporizing, the more power you can safely pour into it. That's why aluminum is such a convenient baseline, cheap, abundant, and easy to work with, but likely would not be the end of the story. More advanced civilizations would almost certainly develop specialized alloys or layered composites tuned for extreme reflectivity at very specific wavelengths, or built from materials with far higher melting points than aluminum can offer. And this cuts down how many elements you need for a rigid structure to keep the sail reflective and aimed in the right direction. Just as important is what isn't on the sail. You don't want bulky cooling fins, heat pipes, or radiators dangling off it, because every kilogram of thermal plumbing is a kilogram that isn't payload or acceleration. Ideally, the sail sheds heat passively, radiating directly from the same surface that reflects the beam, front and back. The closer you get to a single, ultra-thin membrane that both reflects light and survives the heat, the more efficient the entire system becomes. I probably should discuss this more in the Interstellar Relays episode, but it matters here because it helps us contemplate what kind of traffic we're getting and how wide our space lanes need to be for passing ships, many of which are probably a lot smaller than some mega freighter that might not even be reflecting the light, but going slow enough that they absorb the beam to superheat plasma as a propellant instead, while other vessels might be smaller passenger ships. And there's no obvious minimum size these ships need to be. We could imagine postal yachts tend to have a higher ratio of sail to ship, maybe 50%, and so a modest radioactive isotope thermal generator might run power on a ship of only a few hundred tons, maybe even less. Indeed, automated pods that were 99% sail and only a few kilograms of cargo might be possible. A pod just big enough to carry a person and freeze them might be a very common escape pod method, given that a giant sail that can be used to nudge them with the beams also makes them very visible once it deploys for rescue. You don't need to remember or be able to calculate those numbers, there's no pop quiz coming, but I wanted to walk through those numbers because we didn't really do an example like this in the Interstellar Relay episode, and because it gives us a scale for transit. Beaming systems don't benefit from scaling ever larger as some other spaceship designs do. They can be pretty small, and your advantage with them is that you want to be able to run that beam more or less continuously. In that regard, smaller ships help, and your relay spacing is likely to be on an order of as little as a light hour up to a light day or more. With a big enough aperture for your lens and beams, you can keep focus over distances that great and greater. This is easier with shorter wavelength photons like visible light as opposed to microwaves, which is why we're not automatically using them as our pushing system. So our relay station, our interstellar city-states of interest today, might have several billion people passing by them a year, or even more later when the galaxy is more developed. If those ships are in 10,000 person increments, you might see 1,000 such ships pass by every day. And honestly, I suspect that would be conservative. That is not happening anytime soon, but populations can grow fast when abundance exists amid it, and even during a colonization push to fill Alpha Centauri and other systems, sending 10 million colonists a year would be entirely plausible and maybe even conservative, and still means 1,000 such ships pass each relay station a year. So now we're seeing the scale such stations need to exist at, and we're also seeing energy levels that would support many hundreds of times the population of those ships it's pushing without using a sizable fraction of that power for life support. 150 kilowatts a person is pretty generous life support power, even when you need to produce sunlight artificially to grow food. So a relay station expected to keep 1.5 terawatt beam capacity on hand could devote just 1% of that for life support and support 10 million people itself. So what are they up to? In many cases, probably not much that involves shipping directly. It's worth remembering that most people who live in a port town, especially in modern times, have very little to do with ships themselves. A grocery store there works much the same as anywhere else. We don't want to make too many assumptions about what jobs might exist in the future, or what kind of people, but your average 41st century citizen might complain about being called up for their turn reviewing the decisions made by AIs, grumbling that it's the second time this year they've been summoned for AI duty, or perhaps they still work 40-hour weeks, trying to stay busy and ward off existential boredom in an age where automation can do almost everything. But whether the labor is done by humans or machines, there's plenty of it to go around. Let's set up an example. Imagine a relay line between Tau Ceti and Earth. We'll call it the TCE line, and the station of interest today is TCE 1592, nicknamed Magellan Station. Tau Ceti lies 12 light-years away, and for context, that's about 113 trillion kilometers, or roughly 70 trillion miles. Every frontier needs outposts, and every outpost eventually becomes a community. Ports turn into cities, lighthouses into capitals, relays begin as infrastructure, but once they gain permanent residence, engineers, traders, and families, they start developing identities. Culture follows utility, and soon the line between machine and polity blurs. Now on the TCE line, the stations begin to thin out once you're a few light months away from either star. Let us assume each relay in deep space is spaced about 11.9 light hours apart, so a message can reach its neighbor, be checked for a few minutes, and returned within a day. That's a separation of roughly 13 billion kilometers, or 8 billion miles, about 86 astronomical units, 3 times Neptune's distance from the Sun, and of course 86 times our own. There would be several hundred of these per light year, and several thousand between most stars. But by the 41st century, humanity has been averaging around 1% population growth per year. Birth rates are lower than in ancient times or even the 21st century, but lifespans and reproductive windows are longer. It's not far off the rate needed to reach Dyson swarm capacity within a couple more centuries. For our example, that works out to about 3.6 quintillion people in the year 4026 AD. Incidentally, given the Sun's luminosity of about 385 trillion terawatts, that still works out to an astonishing 110 megawatts of power per person, and that's assuming no other energy sources such as fusion reactors or power harvested from other stars. Of course, for our TCE line example, Magellan Station, we'll assume fusion is part of its infrastructure. We always talk about fusion being the technology of 20 years in the future, maybe always being that, but this is 20 centuries in the future, so if we hadn't figured out by then, I don't think it would happen. Magellan Station oversees a pair of empty space cylinders running parallel, each about 8 billion miles long and 100 million miles wide. Its legal authority extends even farther, forming a wide disk of jurisdiction dotted with several thousand minor bodies, asteroids and debris ranging from 100 meters to a few kilometers across. Since the relay network makes operations far easier, Most of these bodies are either occupied or have been mined out, or taken to Magellan Station for absorption. Some host small isolationist communities of a few thousand residents, or even stubborn families and hermits who remain self-sufficient but occasionally trade at Magellan. Some are pirates. Beyond this great disk of space, 8 billion miles thick and 100 billion wide, lies wild space. A few travelers drift in and out for trade, but beyond that frontier there are no patrols, no maintenance, and no help for those who venture too far. Big as they are, these are skinny corridors passing through the vast enormity of interstellar space. Even within its borders, Magellan Station governs a disc-shaped region far larger than the ecliptic plane of our own solar system, and several times wider than the Kuiper Belt. Its resources are stretched thin across the vast and empty expanse. Magellan itself isn't located inside either of the two traffic cylinders it manages, but sits between them. One cylinder handles traffic to Earth and the other from Earth. Ships move along these corridors at varying speeds. The fastest traffic runs through the center lanes, while the slower bulk freighters tend to drift just outside controlled zones to avoid tolls. They are kept apart because if a ship explodes in one, its debris is vastly more dangerous as it expands than is the traffic moving the same direction and usually at similar speeds. Ships rarely pass within a few light seconds of each other or the station, meaning most ships never pass closer to the station than the moon is to Earth. Out in the void, natural background material moves at about 1 mile per second, so weekly maintenance sweeps ensure that only the outer 10% of a cylinder accumulates new debris. Larger incoming objects are usually detected far in advance and intercepted by drones. As a result, even the massive freighters cruising along the outer edge at a few percent of light speed rarely suffer serious damage, just the occasional crater the size of a fist from a millimeter-wide grain of dust. Most of these mega freighters seldom require assistance from the station itself. When they do accelerate or decelerate within a system, they tend to do it slowly, waiting for low traffic periods when they can safely draw on beam power without disrupting others. They value them for shore leave, emergencies, anti-piracy, and resupply. A mega freighter massing 500 megatons cannot afford to slow down and refuel, but they can afford to receive a pod of supplies rapidly accelerate up to them in a parachute pod, a cargo pod attached by graphene tethers to an ultra-thin light sail. They can launch those themselves with people in them and let them be decelerated, and crew members who have gotten into trouble are often fired out the back of the vessel to be slowed down and taken on board a relay station. In some cases, they could even take such pods ahead of their ship, pushed by its own laser, to arrive at the station before the ship would, enjoy some shore leave, and then catch up to them, being fired by another laser from Magellan, as the ship is simply vastly more massive than the personnel pod, and never travels very fast. Magellan Station itself resembles the great space corridors it oversees, a pair of vast, parallel cylindrical habitats, each many miles long and wide, but that resemblance is lost on those passing by, since the station and its many subsidiary platforms are enclosed within a mostly hollow spherical shell about 50 miles across, built from multiple layers of metal interleaved with ice and frozen volatiles, remnants of the original 10-mile wide ice ball that was mined and refined to create it. Inside this enormous shell, ships are built and repaired, and agri-habitats grow food, mostly to feed the station's 3 million permanent residents and a roughly equal number of visitors, from merchant crews and patrol ships to drifters and hitchhikers. For those unable to book passage on the faster non-stop vessels, interstation transports depart daily, carrying people and cargo to the next relay up or down the line. These slower craft travel about 1% light speed, arriving a few months later at their destination. Many individuals gifted with long lifespans, sometimes naturally, sometimes not, travel this way, hopping from station to station, staying a few months before continuing on. Every 10th station or so serves as a cross-junction, where ships are diverted along different routes or slowed as they approach from off-angle trajectories. These junctions are bustling hubs for wanderers and wayfarers, places where those who left their previous ships for any number of reasons gather to await new passage. Many a colonist on a decades-long voyage changes their mind along the way and take a parachute pod to such a port, deciding to return home or perhaps to abandon one expedition and join another, bound for a different star on a different line. And for all the several million who live at Magellan, far more pass by each month like ghosts, Maybe 1 in 10 stops to refuel or get a powered shove. But most out this far are already at cruising speed. Still, there's always someone who wants to order something. Maybe a 1-ton parachute pod filled with local delicacies, or a captain who wants to drop off a crewmate who he's had enough of, or vice versa. Stations like Magellan are always busy. Each station is a world unto itself, but no station stands alone. They trade, feud, and form alliances like old Renaissance city-states, bound together by the light they share. Some are technocracies run by AI councils, others are democracies or hereditary guild hoardings. Over millennia, these cultures diverge wildly, some serene and philosophical, others fierce and expansionist, but all interdependent, connected by the same luminous arteries through space. None can completely shut the line down either, not without being willing to fire, as people can drift through their space or divert around them. But this represents a major inconvenience or risk, and thus we can't imagine alliances, cartels of relays, coups, takeovers, even troops sent from home to reconquer a rebellious relay city-state, which would be no easy task considering they sport a giant laser cannon. Intercity state feuds utilizing proxies and pirates is believable too, and they have the skill to do it. These places could individually dwarf the population of major modern nations. When we talk about massive interstellar city-states linking empires centuries away, we're also talking about continuity, archives, backups, redundancy, and the stubborn refusal to stay dead. That's the focus of my Nebula exclusive this month, Lazarus Protocols, where we explore how advanced societies might bunker, hibernate, archive themselves, and even resurrect entire species after extinction-level events. And it's just one of dozens of full-length exclusives I've released on Nebula over the years. In addition to monthly exclusives like Lazarus Protocols, you'll find extended editions, bonus content, and a deep back catalog of episodes you won't find anywhere else. Plus, every single episode of SFAA premieres there early and completely ad-free. Nebula is creator-owned, built by the people actually making the content, and it's where the full archive of this channel really lives. Use my link or the QR code on the screen to get 50% off an annual plan, just $30 for the whole year, and start watching today. It wasn't until I was running the numbers on just how big the traffic between Kardashev-scale civilizations might be that I realized just how huge these stations would be. They could be entirely automated, and early ones might be, but the sheer power supply involved and vital nature of their role makes it desirable and feasible to go beyond the idea of automation or small deep space communities to mighty city-states. And just like with our asteroid belt city-states, we'd expect all that excess power production to be used to give an edge to some local manufacturing that tends to specialize to trade between relays and eventually develop satellite facilities. Some start off growing some hydroponic grapes and eventually make that into a small luxury market for wine, and the demands there and at other relays are high enough they retire to nearby ice balls to turn into a vineyard. Others specialize in repairing laser sails, and like cities on a river, they become natural hubs of rural areas around them. They become the nodes on ever-thickening branches reaching out ever wider into the galaxy. For all their skill and sophistication, stations like Magellan are reminders that civilization is never just about steel and power beams. It's about continuity. The great relay lines between the stars may stretch across dozens of light years, but what really binds them are the people who maintain them, trade across them, and sometimes just live out their quiet lives in the thin light of distant suns. Empires rise and fall, but the lights along those routes stay on, small, stubborn flames burning against infinity. And perhaps that's how humanity endures its greatest expansion, not through grand fleets or utopian colonies, but through these city-states in the dark, each one a little world of its own, trading culture and memory back and forth across centuries. To travelers born in an age of interstellar highways, the stars would not be distant beacons to wish upon, they would be neighborhoods, and as we've always done, we'll fill those neighborhoods with stories, with industry, and with the noise and wonder of civilization that refuses to be still, even the darkest voids of interstellar space where there is no sun, just rivers of light stretching between civilizations of such immensity that they dare to tackle a galaxy.